It's 12:05. So we welcome our nice audience and we start this webinar today on experiences on cannabis regulation across the countries. I immediately give the floor to our director, Alexis Gustil, who is with us today. Alexis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marika. Can you hear me? Yeah?
Yes, very well.
So, good morning. Hello, everybody. It's not morning already in many countries today of our participants. It's already the 29th edition of the now famous or relatively famous EMCDDA webinars. We kickstart after the summer holiday with a very important topic, which is the cannabis policy. It's certainly one of the top-level policy issues everywhere in the world, but in particular in Europe too, together with a few others like synthetic opioids or cocaine, of course. But as far as a policy issue, there have been recent changes in the EU and around the EU, like in Switzerland, that make the cannabis policy topic, I think, the hot potato for all of us for the next years. And in that moment, what is extremely important for us as the EMCDDA and becoming soon the European Union Drugs Agency is more than ever to be able to provide the fair, correct, and accurate information regarding what is being done and what is not being or going to be done in the countries. There is a lot of confusion, partly because the topic is difficult, also because the legislative approaches are different, and certainly it's very different from what is being done in other regions in the world, like in the Americas. And therefore, I think the first mission of the Drugs Agency is to provide the best possible objective information. And I can already tell you that we are preparing the new program and the new services or upgraded services that the European Drugs Agency will provide us from July next year. And it's not a surprise, I'm sure for you, that there will be a specific focus and follow-up. We already have a special hub, information hub on our website on cannabis policy, but this will be one of our priority areas. And today, to animate the meeting, we have Lisbeth Van Dam, who's the head of sector for support to policy and who's having a specific responsibility for developing the information on this information hub, but also we are preparing together the future services to be provided by the EMCDDA. So thank you and good luck, Lisbeth, together with all of us for those new challenges. I want to welcome, starting with ladies first, Marguerite and Esther and Leonid. I think Marguerite and Esther, they are well known for us in the EMCDDA family or community because they are the head of the EMCDDA National Retox Focal Points, and they play an essential role in the work of the agency and certainly also in the future. So they are extremely well placed to present you and to inform in objective and correct terms what is decided or what is going to be decided in their country. So I'm very happy to have again the opportunity to learn from them. And Leonid is also a very special guest to us today. First of all, because if I'm not wrong, he's relatively recent in his position. And the activity in Malta is also quite recent, and there are interesting developments. And as you can imagine, there will be other webinars also to present the other countries. And that's a situation that is changing very quickly. So we will continue to keep you informed. And not only to describe, we are also developing and preparing analysis, and there are additional services. Before I finish my introduction, I want to welcome the audience coming from so many countries. Many friends I found in the list I just pick one that I don't know, but it's one of the places where we learned a lot of new things from 30 years ago, which is we have a colleague, a fellow policeman from Merseyside, and I must say that the experience in Merseyside 30, 35 years ago was providing us interesting lessons to learn. And I'm happy that despite Brexit, we still managed to keep some contacts. And I really want to welcome you, and of course, all the colleagues attending from everywhere in the world. And my last word is for Marika, for Alessandra, for Marco, and all the colleagues that since the beginning of the COVID pandemic and our first webinar have helped us to improve, to further develop. I think when we organized the first webinar, we did not imagine that so quickly we would celebrate the 29th edition. And I can tell Marika, the next one for the 30th needs to be even more interesting. So I put the challenge from your side. So I wish you, I'm sure we are going to have a fantastic webinar, and I will join you. I stay with you, but I will contribute to the final conclusion at the end of the webinar. So Marika, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Alexis, for your words, inspiring and challenging. Be careful, because we take your challenges. And also for having introduced already the chair today, Lisbeth Van Dam, Head of Support to Policy Sector. Just one recommendation for the audience: include your questions in the questions and answers space, so that we can take them towards the end of this webinar. Lisbeth, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Alexis, for the introduction, and thanks very much for my colleagues for inviting me and the panelists to have this very, hopefully very interesting webinar on a topic that's really a very important priority. And it's really my pleasure to have three very important guest speakers here with us today, and also welcome to the audience. And so let's So just a few words of introduction from my side. So as the director already mentioned, cannabis policies are becoming increasingly complex in Europe, not only because we have cannabis policies, let's say, in the strict sense of the control of illicit cannabis, but what we have seen over many years, since many years, is now also the regulation of cannabis for therapeutic purposes. And there we have seen on the one hand medicinal cannabis products with a marketing authorization, but we have also seen across the EU how different systems have been set up to regulate cannabis for therapeutic purposes. And then also in recent years, we have seen other emerging uses and forms appearing on the market, such as cannabis-derived products, such as CBD, being used or being proposed as food products, or being used in wellness products. So this is just to say how cannabis policies are increasingly complex or broader than we have seen them ever before. And what is the topic of this webinar is really to have a closer look at how some of the EU member states are changing their policy approaches to recreational cannabis use. So we have here the examples of Malta, Germany, and the Netherlands, but we also have seen interesting developments in Luxembourg, Czechia, and the non-EU Switzerland. So in addition to some of the elements that the director already mentioned, I would also like to emphasize here, and this is also some of the work that we have been doing with the with the countries, is really the importance of monitoring and evaluating some of the changes in these countries. Just very briefly to give an overview, and you will hear more details from, of course, the experts in these panels, is from Malta. We know that Malta legislated in 21, which was the first EU country for home grow and non-profit clubs. Luxembourg legislated recently for home grow and use in private. Germany is planning to permit home growing and also non-profit clubs, while Luxembourg and Germany both plan to develop a system for sales later. Then we have the Netherlands, where we see a pilot for a closed cannabis supply chain in 10 out of 350 municipalities, and Czechia included in its addiction action plan also the priority of a regulated cannabis market. In the non-EU Switzerland, we see that there is a model set up to allow cities to experiment with a maximum of 5,000 consumers per city. And these first experiments, they were launched in January 23. And in the meantime, other experiments have been set up. Just to, as an illustration, we have been working to provide policymakers and other target audiences with information that is helpful and objective. So some of the reports we published recently are around low THC cannabis products, the medical use of cannabis and cannabinoids. And recently in June, we published an overview of cannabis laws in Europe. Upcoming is also a technical report on monitoring and evaluating changes in cannabis policies insights from the Americas. So there is already the report from 2018, but given all the changes that are happening in the Americas, there was a need for an update of this report, which will hopefully come out very soon. And again, I would like to take this message also, so regardless of the nature of the policy change, an assessment of the impact is dependent on good baseline data as a basis for ongoing monitoring and evaluation. And I believe that some of our panelists of today will also share their experiences from this point of view. So this was just a few introductory remarks from my side. I will now hand over to the first panelist, which is Leonid McKay, and he's the chairman of the Authority for the Responsible Use of Cannabis in Malta. And thanks a lot for being with us here today. It's really an honor to have you here. And we've asked you to answer the following question. So 2 years into the implementation of your new regulation in Malta, can we already learn some lessons from your point of view? The floor is yours, Leonid.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Thanks also to Director Alexis Gusdel and EMCDDA for giving us the opportunity to share with you and the rest of the participants in this webinar on the major milestones of the Maltese reform on cannabis for non-medical use. So I will today focus my brief presentation on cannabis for non-medical use. And to start with, I'd like again to introduce myself as the chairperson. It's been since November last year. I'm the chairperson of the new Authority for the Responsible Use of Cannabis in Malta. As you've already mentioned this bit in your introduction, back in 2021, it was in December, Malta became the first EU country to partially decriminalize cannabis. I'm being very careful not to use legalized cannabis, because we have partially decriminalized cannabis and allow for a regulatory framework to establish what we call not-for-profit system to cultivate and distribute cannabis. So the main focus, I will make a few mentions on the topic of the not-for-profit, because the authority was born straight after the law was enacted in 2021. And primarily our aim as an authority is to register, amongst other objectives, but primarily is to register and license not-for-profit association, what we term them as Cannabis Harm Reduction Association. So to start with my presentation, I'd like to ask Marco to share a very, very brief, it's just a 1 minute, on the major milestones, which goes back from December 2021 up till today. So Marco, please. So thank you, Marco. I'd like to start once again by being very clear on our key driving principle. We do not in Malta perceive cannabis as if cannabis is a commodity on the open market. So it is not our aim. Our reform is not about the maximization of profits. Our reform is not about a new economic niche. In fact, our model is not embedded in the commercialized open market. So I myself have advocated against a full-blown free-for-all commercialized market in the cannabis area. So our focus is purely on public health and harm reduction. So in Malta, we strongly believe that a full-blown commercialized market goes against the very principles of harm reduction. So we do not aim, this is very important to mention, we do not aim to have a shift from cannabis users from the illegal market towards a new business market. That's not our aim as a Maltese reform. What we aim, but, is to have a shift of existing cannabis users from the illicit, illegal market towards a more regulated, not-for-profit sector. I will elaborate further on what we mean by the not-for-profit. It's quite a unique model. Malta is a very small country. For those who are non-familiar with the European Union, those coming from abroad, a very small country, just right in the middle of the Mediterranean. And our model is quite unique, which, by the way, this reform started off years ago with a very vibrant grassroots movement. This reform was led actually by cannabis users themselves. So the trigger the starting point was a very much community-based journey, led also by community-based NGOs. I can mention Relief in Malta or Graffiti in Malta and other NGOs who are representing cannabis users. So primarily this reform started off as a very much grassroots reform by cannabis users themselves. And so the main objectives of our reform in the cannabis field is related to public health, very, very important. As I mentioned, I will reiterate harm reduction, to remove the criminal status of cannabis use, which was very prevalent for many, many years, to also address the unintended consequences of the criminalization of use. That's very important, but without moving towards a full-blown commercialized market. So we do not subscribe to the idea that it is either the illegal market or the business market. So in our reform, it's very much embedded into, we want to shift existing users from the illicit market towards the not-for-profit market. And as an authority, it is important to mention that we are not about promoting cannabis use. I mean, to the contrary, we remain steadfast against this encouraging, or we want to discourage or delay use. But on the other hand, we firmly believe that the existing cannabis users should not rely on illegal sources. So this is a very, very important point which I would like to make, that we want a shift from the dangers of the legal market for current cannabis users. And we have different tools how to address the shift. Firstly, by introducing home growing in Malta. So this was a very important tool in spite of certain regulatory challenges. We strongly believe that home growing for personal use is a very important tool to address the dangers, the perils of the illicit and irregular market. So our law allows for 4 plants in one's ordinary residence and up to 50 grams for personal use, for personal possession, which cannot be shared or cannot be sold to third parties. Again, the home growers should not have plants visible to third parties and to minors. So this first important tool is home growing for cannabis users. On the other hand, and my emphasis of this presentation is on the second most important tool, which is the cannabis harm reduction associations. Cannabis harm reduction associations should be registered first and foremost and licensed by the authority, in this case, the Authority for the Responsible Use of Cannabis. It takes the legal form of a sort of an association of persons. And you should have 2 founders, at minimum 2 founders who should be residents of Malta for at least 5 consecutive years. So to set up an association and to be licensed by the authority, you should have 2 founders who are residents of Malta for at least 5 consecutive years. It should operate, these associations should operate on a not-for-profit basis, and any surplus, not profit, surplus, has to be reinvested within the same association. It is also very important that such associations whose aim is to cultivate cannabis and distribute cannabis to adult members, these associations should very much be members-based. So this is not about shareholders, this is not about owners of a company. This is about having a members-based association who are cultivating collectively for their own personal use. So these associations should be equally owned by the members. And in fact, associations should be governed by the yearly, minimum yearly annual general meeting. It is also important to note that each association should not exceed 500 members. We allow for smaller categories. In fact, we try to incentivize more small-based associations so that there is more the element of the community grassroots. And I will mention again that the sole purpose of such associations is to cultivate and distribute cannabis to their own personal members. So that's the only sole purpose. In Malta, we strongly object to the so-called monopolies. So we are not promoting big associations to take control of the cannabis reform. In fact, we expect that the association, that's why we expect associations to take full responsibility of the whole process from seed to distribution. A very important element is that the sites, the places of such association should be at minimum 250 meters away from schools, youth centers, or any other youth clubs. So that's a very important point to mention. And in Malta, like in a few other countries in the European Union, we are also banning any form of marketing. So we are not allowing any marketing online. Associations, on the other hand, can distribute dried cannabis flowers only to their members. So as a start, we're not allowing edibles, pre-roll joints, or any form of concentrate. So the focus, the starting point of this reform is to allow these associations to distribute dried flower only. A very important element in our harm reduction tool is that the associations should invest in a standard format of labeling, whereby the labels on the product being distributed to the members should indicate clearly, amongst others, the levels of THC and CBD on each packet to inform users on potency. We are now discussing with prospective associations what kind of labeling, what kind of packaging they should use in their distribution of the cannabis product. We're also not capping THC limit, except for a particular age group. In Malta, we are putting a cap on the THC limit for those aged between 18 to 21. So we advise users to consume THC, cannabis with THC levels with less than 15%. But on the other hand, legally, we are allowing them to consume cannabis with THC level of not more than 18%. But we advise for a lower THC level. An important element of the harm reduction initiative is that the authority is expecting the association founders, administrators, and key persons to undergo training on harm reduction. This is mandatory. So this is not optional for associations. They should be, once they are licensed and registered with the authority, they should attend regular training. And in fact, I am pleased to share with you that we're having the first training of Cannabis Harm Reduction Association in November. So towards the end of November, we're having the first training for the first Cannabis Association. Another important element which I would like to mention in our reform is that we are not promoting drug tourism. Tourists and short-term visitors coming to Malta cannot procure cannabis from licensed associations. So our aim is not to promote any form of drug tourism, but to promote a regulated, highly regulated market for those who are users currently in Malta. I'd like also to mention some important milestones, but the major two milestones, which I'm very proud of as chairperson, is firstly that the end of last February in Malta, we opened up for the first time the applications for the application process for prospective associations. We had a very, very interesting convention the month before in January. So the authorities started to open up to prospective associations. And then we committed ourselves that in February this year, we will open the application process. And so we did. So the application process was opened in February. And the 8th of June, last 8th of June, we had our real solid press conference on harm reduction and what we perceive, what we expect of associations to go through for harm reduction. So these two important milestones, along with the others, are very important for us. The opening up of association, the application, and the harm reduction press conference. And with respect to the regulatory framework, we did not have the privilege of a copy and paste exercise. So our model is quite unique because the focus, as I've mentioned several times, is not on the commercialized market, but we had to create a regulatory framework sort of from scratch. And in fact, over the past few months, we have designed technical standards, what we expect of associations in their operations, in terms of distribution, in terms of security, in terms of sampling and testing. The testing part is a very, very important part of our reform. So we expect associations to do testing before they distribute cannabis to their own members. And we, as an authority, have the discretion to test also samples from the association's cannabis product. What kind of packaging, what kind of labeling. So over the past few months, we have created the whole technical standards, which are online on our website. In addition to that, we have created and designed also the harm reduction directive, the directive on governance and administration, on which approved sites as an authority we will giving licenses. So over the past few months, as an authority, we have built the whole regulatory framework for the Maltese reform. And in fact, after 2 months, so we opened up end of February, fast forward to 2 months, so in April, end of April, we received the first batch of applications. So, and then our licensing team started the process of vetting, of due diligence, of the founders, of the operations, of the financial projections of each associations. But apart from that, as an authority, we knew that it is very important that it should not be about the associations themselves only, because we know that the associations will be directly working with the authority, but also with other parts of the ecosystem, like the banking structure, like the laboratories, so that we will have enough local labs to test the product. Other local government authorities. So it is important as an authority we open up and discuss what is our regulatory framework about with the police. And we've seen very good progress in terms of how the police are perceiving nowadays cannabis users. With the employers, a very important discussion with the employers themselves, and also with non-Maltese authorities, including the International Narcotic Control Board. So over the past few months, it was a very important journey, not only to discuss and meet with prospective association, but also with the whole ecosystem. Another important point, which I should mention, is that the authority should and I admit we have not yet done this in a very robust way. I think we should open up also to cannabis users themselves. And as much as they started off this reform, they should keep on be the drivers also of how our regulatory framework shape this reform. After all, what we're after is that the cannabis users are actually resorting to not to the illegal market, but also to a safe regulated market. And to conclude my brief presentation, we're also working on an IT system. I am not an IT person myself, so our team is working on a centralized, anonymized IT system so that each member should subscribe and create this membership for within the association. So we are strongly advocating so that each, this is the law, each member should not be in more than one association at the same time. So I'm pleased to conclude by saying that in Malta, we have just issued the first in principle licenses to a number of associations, and now I have visited two on-site inspections, like on prospective associations. So I'm very pleased to say that by the end of the year, we will most probably have the first licenses, the full operational license in Malta for cannabis harm reduction associations. Thank you very much for now. I'll give the floor to yours back.
Thanks a lot, Leonie. That was a very comprehensive and interesting outline of the regulatory framework and how it was has been implemented in Malta. I see there's lots of questions already coming in, both in the chat and in the Q&A. We will leave all the questions until the end of the three panelists. And just a reminder, please put your questions in the Q&A stream, not in the chat, because that's where we will be looking at the questions on. So now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Esther Neumeyer. She is the head of the German focal point and working at the Institute for Therapy Research. Esther will be answering the following questions. So Germany is preparing to regulate recreational cannabis. What does it mean for one of the largest EU countries to prepare for such a change? What are the possible future scenarios and the implications for policy, practice, and research? Esther, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lisbeth. Thank you for the invitation as well, also, of course, to Alexi. It's a pleasure to be here. I really like the EMCDDA seminars. I've been to some of the webinars myself, and so I'm very happy to speak today. You've seen the questions that have been asked. Just to make this very clear, let me see if I have the... Yes, great. Just to make this very clear, I'm not part of the government. I'm also not part of any cannabis association, so I have no conflict of interests here. Just to keep in the spirit of good science, because that's what we do here. We do the science and the monitoring. To answer these two questions, I will take you briefly through the past 2 years in Germany, and I will take you through what has been happening and try to give you an idea of what of this may be Germany specific, what may have to do with the EU, and then of course, what are we planning right now and what's going to happen. But I can already say some of what Leonid has just told you about the growers associations you will hear again, and I will make this very brief, the parts that you've just heard. So going back 2 years ago in September 2021, a new government has been voted into office in Germany. So we had parliament elections, and for the first time in November 2021, we had a coalition that was made up of the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Liberal Party. And this is a coalition that has never existed before in Germany. So they are doing some things that have not been done before. And one of them was that the coalition agreement in November 2021 included that they wanted to install recreational cannabis for adults in licensed stores. So they wanted a complete chain of production of legal cannabis in licensed stores or in pharmacies in Germany. It was just a small thing in a coalition agreement. You know how big these documents are, and this was just one small paragraph. And yet, of course, for the world of drug research, it was a big deal. So even then, even just in the small paragraph, the focus of the new regulation was very clear. And it was about quality controlled cannabis. It was about health protection, and it was about harm reduction. It was about the fact that there should be no contaminations and that we need to do better in youth protection and prevention. So I think the focus is very much the same as what you've just heard from Leonid. It's really about just saying, okay, we have a lot of cannabis users and we need to do better by them. And also we need to protect young people. What has also been discussed all the time, basically, was that we should combat the black market, that of course users should be decriminalized. And what has also always been part of this new regulation, of any idea of it, was that there is to be a scientific evaluation to be finished 4 years after the new regulation comes into effect, whenever that may be. So this was November 2021, and there was an uproar. It was a big thing. And then in October 2022, we had the first cornerstones of a new legislation draft. So again, not even a legislation draft, just the first ideas. In the 10 months or 11 months in between, what happened was there was a large consultation process with experts and interested parties. So a lot of government consultations with scientists, with growers, of course, with people who use cannabis. So really it was a large thing, and it ended in the cornerstones in October 2022. And there were basically 2 lines there, and one line was to say, okay, we will have a commercial supply chain for all of Germany. This is quite important. And then we will allow for home growing as a second cornerstone. So that was October 2022. And then in April 2023, so a good half year later, we had a second round of cornerstones. And these look quite different if you look at them, because first, there was not only home growing, but there was also the option of what I would call cannabis social clubs, kind of what they've been called for many years. So grower associations, non-profit grower associations. And then there was a second cornerstone, and that was suddenly much smaller than what had been said before. And that was to say, okay, we will have model regions with a commercial supply chain, and these will be evaluated scientifically, these model regions. And what happened in between was that our government consulted with the European Commission. And this is where we go back into the European view to say Germany is not an isolated country. We are large, yes, but we are part of the EU and we are part of international agreements. And what was there from the start was that our government said, whatever we do, it needs to fit into the international agreements that we're in. And so there was a government consultation with the European Commission. It is not public. We don't know what exactly has been discussed there. But what is public is that the Minister of Health then said, okay, these are our new cornerstones. And if you look at Luxembourg was mentioned by Lisbeth earlier. This is something that has happened before. Luxembourg has had a very similar plan to Germany and is now actually in a very similar process saying, oh, okay, we will do something else. So whatever has happened there precisely, it was quite clear that this old German idea of we will have commercial supply chains for all of Germany would not be happening anytime soon. So since April 2023, we now have a draft law since June 2023 published for this Pillar 1. So we have a draft law saying home growing and cannabis social clubs will happen this way. And I will tell you a little bit later what this law will look like. In August 2023, this draft law has gone through the cabinet. And so now what's happening at the moment is that it's going to Parliament. What's quite interesting is I've seen headlines, international headlines in the media saying, oh, Germany has legalized cannabis. No, we haven't. You cannot get recreational cannabis in Germany that is in any way legal, because we do have a parliament and we are a democracy, and new laws have to go through Parliament first. And this law has not been in Parliament yet, and this is really quite important. If you do use cannabis, it's not legal. It is expected, and this is the near future, we do expect the law to go through Parliament this year. That's what the Minister of Health, who is chiefly responsible for the law, what he has said. And we do expect it to come into force by the end of this year. So take a step back, have a look at what Leonie just said about Malta. We are actually not even where Malta has been 2 years ago. This is quite important. We have been working on this for 2 years, and we're not yet there. So the law has not actually passed. We do have a pillar 2 for the model regions with commercial supply chains, and we don't have a draft law yet. It's supposed to be drafted also this year, and we do expect it to be submitted to the European Commission for assessment. So to check whether this draft law actually fits with international law and with all the things that Germany is supposed to on an international level. And of course, there's another thing that has been happening in the background all the time, and this is something I need to say because I'm a scientist, and that's that, of course, we have all been preparing from a scientific level. There has been a lot of preparation. The government is really taking quite some time to prepare this on a scientific basis. So Lisbeth said earlier, you always need a good baseline if you want to do an evaluation. So this baseline is really being worked on. There have been quite a few projects, scientific projects, to provide this baseline to keep in line with the possibility of an evaluation. So I will give you just the gist of what's in the draft law at the moment, just to kind of tell you what we expect to happen in the more or less near future. So we have this part. One very important is youth protection. So everything that I will say now goes only for adults 18 years and over. Adults will be allowed to grow up to 3 plants, ensuring, of course, that there is no access for minors to these plants, and adults can join what I think most of us would call cannabis social clubs, or if you stick to a closer translation, non-profit communal growing clubs. What's quite important, an adult may possess up to 25 grams of cannabis, and the only types of cannabis that at the moment will be legal are the flowers and the resin. So very similar to what Leonid said earlier, no edibles, no oils at the moment, all of that doesn't exist. And possession will remain illegal for minors. However, minors, of course, don't go to jail. If a minor is caught with cannabis and there is the suspicion that they may be having cannabis problems, they can be referred to the proper prevention programs and early intervention programs. Now, there are a few other health protection things in there. There's a general ban on advertising and sponsoring both for cannabis and cannabis social clubs. So no advertising. A cannabis social club is allowed to write their name out front of the building that they have, but that's pretty much it. Using cannabis, and this is, I think you've just heard this from Leonid, using cannabis is banned within 200 meters of anywhere that is likely to have a lot of children. So schools, kindergartens, sports facilities, and so on. Cannabis social clubs must be non-profit, and they do fall under very strict regulations. And these regulations, and now we come to a very German point, are to be enforced by the federal states. Germany is a very, very, very federal country. You have 16 federal states. We're a big country. And every federal state is governed by a different government, by a different coalition. So we can kind of expect them to be to differ in how they interpret these regulations and how they enforce them. So we are very likely to end up with different speeds at which this will develop within the country, just because if you have a very, shall we say, conservative government, it is quite likely that they will take longer to prove, to have a look at whether or not the regulations are being kept. And so we kind of expect there to be different developments in different parts of Germany. This is very German. We're used to this. From a scientific viewpoint, it's quite interesting because it means that we will have something like control groups to look at and see whether it actually makes a difference or not in the indicators that we will have. So any cannabis social club may have up to 500 adult members, of course, and dispense both the flowers and the resin only to them. They can dispense up to 25 grams per day or 50 grams per month. And just like in Malta, we have special regulations for young adults, so from 18 to 21 years, they can only get up to 30 grams per month and a maximum THC content of 10%. And of course, the clubs are supposed to test for THC content. They're supposed to test for any adulterations in the cannabis, for any problems that they might have. And they have to, any cannabis that is given out has to be given out in plain packaging and packaging that contains the THC and the CBD content. So there is a lot of consumer protection there as well. Again, you've just heard this from Malta. Any cannabis social club must name a responsible person for prevention and harm reduction. They must also offer advice and information on cannabis use and also on cannabis use problems. And they have to work together with local drug counseling services. So if any member seems to have a problem, they really are supposed to encourage them to go to counseling services and to get help. Another part of the law is that prevention measures are supposed to be strengthened Germany-wide. Again, we're a big country and a lot of prevention is happening on a very regional level. So it will be interesting to see how this plays out. And still, the effects of the law are to be evaluated continuously, so all the time, but the evaluation is supposed to be finished after 4 years. So this is just pillar one. We don't really know when even this will come to pass, because as you've seen from Malta, it takes quite a while to go from a law, even from a law that's gone into effect, to actually having grown cannabis. At the same time, we already have people lining up for the cannabis social clubs. So there are already clubs being opened, even though it's a bit difficult to do that right now because there's no law. But anyway, people are already preparing. There is a lot of interest in this. So even though it takes some time, we will certainly see a lot of development there. And then, of course, there's pillar two. We don't know when these supply chains will actually come into effect, when these model regions will actually start happening. And I can't give you any good idea on how long that will take, because it's very hard to see that happening now. That's it from me. Thank you very much. And I will get to Lisbeth.
Thanks a lot, Esther. That was very insightful, a bit of a different perspective and definitely a difference in the timeline compared to the previous speaker. So now it's my pleasure to ask Marguerite to give her presentation. So Marguerite is head of the Drug Monitoring and Policy Department at the Trimbos Institute and also head of the Dutch focal point. And the question that we've asked Marguerite to answer is, so I'll read it. The Netherlands cannabis policy pioneered a different form of regulation. Can you provide an historical overview and share your current challenges? Marguerite, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lisbeth and Alexis and other colleagues for inviting me at this webinar. I will try to give a very brief overview of Dutch cannabis policy and where we are now at the moment with the cannabis supply chain experiment. We are part of the Rijtox network of the EMCDDA. We have no conflict of interest with regard to the design of the experiment, but we are part of the consortium evaluating the experiment. I will come to this issue later. In fact, Dutch cannabis policy dates back to the 70s, when a distinction was made between cannabis and more harmful drugs like heroin and cocaine. And this was in fact based on scientific evidence regarding the health risks. And since then, the sale of cannabis for personal use to adults was tolerated or is tolerated under strict conditions. And the aim of this policy is to avoid criminalization of cannabis users and also to prevent them to come into contact with more serious drugs like heroin and cocaine. So it's in fact the separation of the soft drugs and hard drugs market. Nowadays, we have some almost 570 coffee shops in the Netherlands in slightly over 100 municipalities where the sale of cannabis is tolerated. However, these coffee shops have to adhere to certain criteria, toleration criteria, we call them. They are not permitted to advertise drugs. They are not permitted to sell hard drugs. They are not allowed to cause nuisance like parking problems or noise or pollution of their customers. They are not permitted to sell cannabis to minors. They are also not permitted to sell large quantities, which means over 5 grams of cannabis to a specific user or a transaction per day. And since 2013, only residents of the Netherlands are allowed to buy cannabis in coffee shops, although these municipalities have to decide about enforcement of this criterion. So in fact, we can say that to some extent, the front door is more or less regulated. However, there is a dilemma because the back door, the production of cannabis and supply of cannabis to the coffee shops is illegal. And this has created quite some problems for public order and safety because of illicit cannabis cultivation and related crime that may undermine society. So after many years, almost 40 years, in 2017, this situation has resulted in a pledge in the coalition agreement of the former government to conduct an experiment with regulated cultivation and sale of cannabis. And well, the aim of this so-called cannabis experiment is to ascertain whether or not it is possible to regulate a quality-controlled supply of cannabis to coffee shops, and second, to study the effects of a regulated supply chain on different indicators related to crime, safety, public nuisance, and public health. And the legislation that is necessary for the experiment to take place was enforced in July 2020. Well, this is an overview of what we call the experimental intervention. And in fact, the intervention consists of the implementation and enforcement of an extensive set of regulations and legislation, ranging from the production of cannabis until the sale of cannabis in coffee shops. And just to mention a few requirements is that growers, and a maximum of 10 was allowed, and they have been nominated in the meantime, they must ensure that the cannabis is tested for THC and CBD levels at a licensed lab. They have to be able to grow at least 6,500 kilograms per year, and to be able to grow 10 or more varieties of cannabis. There are also strict regulations with regard to heavy metals, microbiologicals, aflatoxins, and pesticides. And growers also have to ensure the security during storage and packaging and transport of the cannabis. And an extensive system, a track and trace system, will be implemented. Growers must keep comprehensive records as these good records are necessary for verifying whether the supply of cannabis is actually controlled. Then there will also be labeling of packages, so-called health-related labels. The packages have to contain information on THC and CBD content, and in contrast to the plants in Malta and Germany, no limits have been defined, also not for minors or young adults. There should be neutral packages like the cigarette packages, and there should be consumer information with information on health risks related to cannabis attached to these packages. And there are all kinds of prevention requirements coffee shop owners have to adhere to. For example, they have to follow a specific licensed course on cannabis and how to deal with problematic cannabis users. And the maximum stock will be up to a week's supply of cannabis, and now it is 500 grams. So that's much more, and probably an average. From the evaluation, it showed that on average 1,300 grams of cannabis is sold in coffee shops per day. So that is much higher. With regard to prevention, also additional measures have been taken to prevent the potential increase in cannabis use, especially among minors and young adults. There will be no national cannabis campaign, but in fact, the focus is on scaling up and implementing existing interventions at local level. And there is also a model or form developed for cannabis prevention and an enforcement plan, which can assist municipalities, well, to conduct a local level situation analysis, to define specific actions, and to connect also health and security professionals. An overview of low threshold online interventions has also been made, and there is also an FAQ on the experiment to inform all kinds of stakeholders. Well, of course, this experiment will have to address several challenges and questions, and I will not mention them all, but of course, a few are very important, whether supply will meet user demand, and there should be at least sufficient varieties. Also hashish, we do know that some 20 to 30% of the cannabis users has a preference for hashish or resin. And of course, it's very important that customers are satisfied about the quality and potency and taste and all kinds of indicators related to cannabis preference. And monitoring prices is very important. If prices are increasing, it may, well, in fact, push customers to the illegal market. If they are too low, the threshold to use cannabis may be also lowered. And of course, a core question is whether there will actually be a closed chain. Is it possible to prevent diversion of cannabis to the illicit market? Well, many of these questions will be addressed in a specific study, an evaluation study, which is conducted by a consortium of 3 research organizations, Breuer Interval, Rand Europe, and the Trimbos Institute. And this study is conducted as a quasi-experimental study. 10 intervention cities have been nominated. In the meantime, they could volunteer to take part in this experiment, and they form the experimental group. And in the meantime, also 10 other cities, they are the comparison cities, they form the control group. And as you can see that all cities or municipalities are distributed throughout the countries. And well, there's not a perfect match, but I think there's a reasonable match in terms of total population, number of coffee shops, number of border cities, and the population or coffee shop density. The evaluation study consists of 3 phases, and during the preparatory phase, a baseline assessment will be conducted and has been conducted in the meantime. Then after the implementation of the intervention, so that means that the quality controlled cannabis is supplied to the coffee shops in the experimental group, will be conducted during 4 annual assessments. And then there will be an evaluation phase. By the end, there will be an evaluation report, and well, the cabinet will decide about the future and continuation of this experiment. Multitude of methods will be applied. There will be surveys among coffee shop visitors, among local residents. The different types of cannabis and products sold in coffee shops will be analyzed by analyzing menus in coffee shops. There will be chemical analysis of cannabis composition in terms of THC and CBD levels. There will also be an analysis of different contaminants. Interviews with stakeholders will be conducted, and registration data from well, police and addiction care and so on will be conducted. And there will also be an online user survey to get a picture and to track traces on the illegal market. Well, this is a very complicated schedule, but I will try to summarize it. We are still in the preparatory phase, and at the end of 2021, a baseline assessment was conducted, but because of all the delays in the experiment, I will tell you later about it. It was necessary to conduct a second baseline, or in fact, it will be the formal baseline by the end of 2022. Then it is expected that by the end of this year, there will be a startup phase in 2 municipalities, in Tilburg and Breda. And it is expected and or planned that in the first quarter of 2024, the transition phase will start. It is a period of 6 weeks during which coffee shops in the experimental group are allowed to sell both the regular cannabis as well as the experimental or quality-controlled cannabis. And then after this phase, the formal intervention will start, but because then coffee shops in the intervention group are only allowed to sell the new regulated experimental cannabis. And then it is expected, I'm a bit cautious about making predictions about this planning and schedule, but probably by the end of 2024, the first official monitor assessment will be conducted. Well, about the delays and lessons learned is that it appeared that the nomination and screening of potential growers took more time than expected. And it turned also out to be a problem for growers to find a location, to obtain licenses, to cultivate cannabis or to obtain a bank account. And it took also more time to grow sufficient high quality, quantity and diversity of cannabis. And the development of a track and trace system and the intensive legislation also took more time. There are also changes to the original design of the study, and the intervention is that in the coalition agreement of our still current cabinet, which has been dismissed in the meantime, it states that a big city had to be added to the intervention group, and probably that this will be a district in Amsterdam. And well, the decision to have a startup phase in Breda and Tilburg, which was probably inspired by the fear that there would be a lack of support or a declining support also at local level. It was also not originally planned, but in these 2 cities, it can be learned from the experiences also, for example, with working with a track and trace system, but it was not part of the original design. So there's quite a lot of information also on the websites of the government, and also about the state of play. And well, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Marguerite, for this very interesting presentation. Thanks again to all the speakers. I don't have an easy role right now because I see there's a long list of very interesting questions in the Q&A. There's a lot of detailed questions on specific aspects of the law, but I've tried to group some of the questions that are also relevant, I think, for some speakers. And one of the questions that I see appearing regularly in the chat is, okay, why the choice for some of the policy models? So why the choice for the non-profit model and the home grow model? So I think that's also a question primarily for Leonid and maybe Esther. And then also linked with that, what about quality control issues in a home grow setting? So maybe this is a bit of a transversal questions, and maybe Leonid, if you could start with that one. You're muted.
Sorry. Why the choice of our model is very clear. As I've said, we are aware that there are different models of how to regulate cannabis, but our key aim as a Maltese reform is to assist current users and not promote amongst new users, assist current users to move from the illicit to a regulated market. So in order to achieve that aim, you can just need cannabis harm reduction associations who are working on not-for-profit. If any association intention is to maximize profit, then the main interest of such an association would no longer be the health, the well-being, the harm reduction element of that current user, but to maximize profits. And so I think our choice was very clear, because we want to prioritize harm reduction, public health, and then assist the current users to access cannabis from a regulated source and not from the illegal source. So the main choice was primarily because our focus is harm reduction.
Maybe Esther or Margriet? I know from a different point of view, because you're not a policy person, but you might have some thoughts around that too.
Yes, I think for the home growing and the non-profit clubs, I mean, Leonid has talked about some of the issues, but there's also I think the thought that it is socially equivalent. So you can have people who have no money or very little money, they can grow their own cannabis, and they don't need to go to a store to buy very expensive cannabis. And this is something that has been mentioned even in the first drafts that we've had, where we still had the for-profit cannabis sales as well. So just to say, okay, so if you don't have the money, you can grow your own. So you don't have to go to an illegal market that is probably going to be cheaper than a legal market. So that was another thing that was mentioned in Germany. And then also, I think it's just a practical thing now. They didn't, you know, it didn't seem feasible to do the whole sales system in Germany. And you had to come up with another system that would allow people to get their cannabis in a legal way. And this is a way to do it. And there has been the question of quality control, and that's a problem for the home growing, definitely. And this has been discussed as well in Germany. But at the same time, of course, you have to say, well, if I grow my own plants at home, no matter which ones, they're always my personal responsibility. So if I grow, I don't know, something and poison myself with it, that will always be my responsibility if it's my garden. So you could argue that, well, this is the same amount of responsibility that you have to take for everything that you grow yourself. And of course, for the growing associations, there will be quality controls. That is the idea.
Thank you. Margriet, yeah.
Yes. Well, in the Netherlands, of course, we have a bit of a different situation, because we had already a long tradition with what we call the front door. So at the level of the consumer, and we do know from surveys that most cannabis users actually get their cannabis in coffee shops. There is, of course, also an illicit market, but the majority buy their cannabis in coffee shops. So the big and the main challenge was the back door to control the supply to the coffee shops. And it's not formulated exactly in the targets that we actually expect the organized crime and illicit production to totally disappear. There are different estimates in the Netherlands. They may range from, well, about 30% to 80% of all cannabis produced in the Netherlands is intended for the export. So that means that if you only regulate the local market, it will not suddenly disappear. But it certainly addresses some of the problems at municipal level, and that are experienced with regard to public order and safety. And of course, it's also an opportunity to control the quality. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for raising the organized crime element in that, because that was another question that appeared in the chat. It's probably a little bit difficult to answer, but what are your expectations in terms of the impact of regulation on the illicit market? We know that, for example, in Canada and in Uruguay, there's been estimates, okay, after the regulation, to what extent has it decreased the illicit cannabis market? And what are your expectations or views on this element? Maybe also Malta and Germany would like to add something on this.
I can start. We are aware that the shift will not happen overnight. The shift will take time. However, I think that the shift from the illicit to the regulated market will happen anyway. It is not just about the price, because in our case in Malta, the prospective associations with the current system are saying that they can match the price of the illicit market already. But I think the shift will not happen just because there's the same price of the illicit market with the regulated market. It's because they will now have access to a quality tested product. It's because they know that they can have harm reduction initiatives. They know what they are consuming. They know the levels of THC in proportion to CBD. They know that the associations are not using chemical pesticides. So certain contaminants, certain harmful effects will be tested. So they know that the associations are there not just to, it's not about maximizing their profits, but to provide this regulated market. So I think the shift will not happen overnight. It would be a gradual shift, but it will happen over a number of years, because the members will start trusting the associations more and more over time.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Leonid.
Just to add to this, certainly it takes time, and we've seen this in Canada as well, where you have a rather large illicit market where people can just buy. Even there, it took quite a while for the legal market to reach a higher percentage. And I think we've also seen in Uruguay that if you have a very limited number of ways of getting legal cannabis, it takes much longer for it to push the illegal market back. And I think realistically, I would not expect a model with home growing and with cannabis social clubs to completely erase the illegal market. I don't think that's realistic, but we will probably see the illegal market being pushed back a little bit. And of course, there is the point that quite a lot of users are quite happy to have controlled cannabis and to be sure there are no adulterations. I've seen synthetic cannabinoids being mentioned in the chat as well. That is a problem that exists on the black markets, and that will certainly not exist. So yeah, it will happen, but it will not eradicate the black market. I don't think that's realistic from everything we've seen from other countries.
And then maybe another broader question, and all three of you briefly mentioned it, but what are the plans, let's say, to in terms of prevention and treatment for cannabis users and harm reduction measures? Esther, there was something around prevention that you mentioned in your presentations, but I've seen questions in the chat. Okay, what about treatment for cannabis users? And Leonid, there was also a question for you. Okay, what about harm reduction measures for people who use cannabis? So maybe that's a last question, if you'd like to share your views on these.
Shall I start again? In our case, we are aware that there's a fine line between what is harm reduction and what is prevention. And so that's why, as a government of Malta, has already invested for 3 years already now in a full package on cannabis prevention, amongst other things. So we are working as an authority with the main prevention agency in Malta. It's called SETA, and we are right now on a regular basis meeting such an entity to assist in the prevention area. So we are not just about harm reduction. We are also investing a lot in prevention measures. We're aware that different age groups require different prevention programs. But with respect to your specific question on harm reduction, we are strong about advocating harm reduction measures, not just in the traditional sense, like not to mix cannabis with tobacco, to use low potent cannabis. But we're also discussing stigmatizing policies. It's also harm reduction. We're also discussing unjust employment laws, again, harm reduction. We're also discussing certain judgmental language at macro level. So on the one hand, we're saying harm and risk reduction from the traditional point of view with respect to the well-being of the person. But we're also seeing harm reduction from a more macro point of view in terms of policies and laws. So we are focusing on lower risk guidelines. So we're saying that the safest way to use cannabis is not to use cannabis at all. But we're aware that people are using cannabis. So we are encouraging them not to delay use as much as possible, not to mix tobacco with other prescribed drugs, not to mix cannabis with alcohol, not to mix cannabis with other substances. So we are focusing on harm reduction from a broader point of view, but without missing on the prevention aspect as well.
Thank you, Leonid. Esther or Marguerite, would you like to add something?
Well, there, in the context of this experiment, there are two streams of prevention. The first is focused on the coffee shop visitors, and well, they get information about the health risks and how to reduce risk. And of course, not using is the best way of prevention. Of course, it remains to be seen what the effects are of those initiatives. And at the other hand, I think focus is on preventing that especially young people and high-risk group will increase their use. We do not know whether this will happen, but it might be that just because the government is, well, so-called allowing the production and sale of cannabis, it might affect risk perception, and it might perhaps lower the threshold among young people. And that's very important issue that will be addressed in this, this experiment, at least at this moment in the experimental municipalities. And there are several materials and initiatives and collaborations between prevention professionals to avoid this potential increase.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot to all three of you. I'm sorry we couldn't answer all the questions because I find this personally a very interesting debate, but I will hand over to our director again for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Lisbeth. I would like to thank again all the presenters because it has been extremely interesting. Well, as I said, we know for many years with Esther and Marguerite, not yet with Leonid, but as we have a meeting of EU agencies in Malta in a few weeks' time, I will keep in touch to organize a visit. I would like to highlight one or 2 points. The first, because I've seen some comments and questions. First of all, thank you for all your questions. Please send us more questions and more comments, because this will help us to understand what are the really important questions on which we should continue to work in the coming weeks and months to be able to to be even more useful in our analysis and in the information we are sharing. The second thing I would like to say is that I was a bit surprised by the tone of some questions, because I think some of you may miss the introduction, which explains that the speakers, they are scientists. They are not advocating against or in favor. So there was one or two comments in the chat that I found was not really understanding what is the context of the meeting. That's a scientific presentation of objective information. I think the three of you, you gave extraordinarily useful, clear, objective information about what is being done, how difficult and how challenging it is. And obviously, this will not per se be the perfect solution to everything. And my last comment is I would like to, there was a question regarding how the EU, or is the EU believing this will be the solution to address a criminal organized group. First, I need to say those policies, those legislations that have been presented today, they are not EU legislation. They are political choices being made by member states. We are going to continue to inform you on that. I think the presentations, especially the one of Esther and Marguerite, illustrate very well some challenges in the process. And when the member states who want to change the legislation, they need to assess what would be the impact, or what is the assessment made at EU level, because they took decisions in the past, for instance, associated to Schengen, which means that this may create legal obstacles for them to go in the direction they initially announced. But this is part of the process, and this is what we are all learning. And I'm sure that this is also a learning experience for member states, the other member states that have not been presented today, and maybe others. So the only thing I can say is that I think that's a topic, and certainly the countries that took initiatives to change the situation, this will have an impact on the reflection at European level between the member states, because that's the responsibility of the member states, not the EU, to decide on the legislation on cannabis. And I think our role is also to help share the information, make people understand what have been the solutions, what are the obstacles and the legal obstacles or the feasibility obstacles. But still, I think it's a excellent opportunity for all of us, including for me, to learn more from what's happening in each country. And I can only praise the work of the agency of Leonid and of the Retox focal points, because it's one more illustration of fundamentalities to have a European agency, but also national focal points that are capable to document, to explain, to help assess. And my ultimate word is you all insisted on the importance of evaluation and monitoring. And this is also where you can count on the European Drugs Agency already today, and even more in the future. So I can only say thank you all once more, and rendezvous next time for other topic and for the other countries. Thank you very much.